My name is Phil Crook. I'm part of the International Development section. I'm not Matthew Powell, who you might have seen on your programme. You can't be with us. And for the avoidance of doubt, neither am I Martina Caterina, the legal advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur. Martina has been called away to replace the Special Rapporteur at a meeting, but she's very kindly sent in her comments of what she was going to say, which I will present as we go through the meeting. So the main presenter today is Mary Strode, a consultant to the UNHCR expert group on refugees and internally displaced persons statistics, which is known as EGRIS. The structure will be slightly different. We have one major speaker, if you like. We have Martina's comments, which I'll present, and then we have Jonathan Harvey from the Northern Ireland Census Office, who will give some inputs towards the end about the way Northern Ireland is handling refugee statistics. So the structure is Mary's going to start, then she'll pause, I will then say a little bit about Martina's thoughts, and then we'll have a break for any questions there might be. Mary then will come back for part 2. Jonathan will then intervene. Mary will then wind up, and then there'll be 10 minutes at the end for general questions that arise. So, Mary.
You may wonder where all these UN recommendations come from and how they get derived. Well, this is one of the most recent UN statistical publications, which give recommendations for refugee statistics, and I've been working on that since 2016, so I want to tell you a little bit about that, and then go on a little bit to discuss some of the concepts and difficulties we had, and then we'll come on to the UK context. So, as you know, we're living in a world of very mobile populations, with a lot of people moving around. And we also at the UN have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And we also have a compact for safe and orderly, regular migration. There's a lot of interest in the UN about displacement in particular. And in 2015, the UN Statistical Commission tasked a group of experts to make some recommendations on refugees and internally displaced persons, because everyone was doing their own thing. And there are an awful lot of both national and international bodies involved in putting these kinds of statistics together. So the work of the EGRIS group began in 2016, and I joined them as a consultant in 2016. And my job is really to pull together all the contributions from the various members and turn it into something like that. So I don't always know all the bits and pieces, but my job is to put it together. So what I want to talk about today is displacement issues, and also some of the things that not only affect displaced persons, but also impact on cross-border workers, seasonal workers, and the general lack of permanence that we have in the world. And when I started trying to put this together, I found there was a bit of a mismatch between our statistical concepts and definitions and people who are living in some kind of turmoil. Because I have a bit of an assumption that we're all in control of our lives, we all know what we're doing, and we all know where we're going. And I heard a little bit about that in the presentation from the ONS this morning. Now, displaced people are unable to freely make decisions about what they're going to do, where they're going to go, and where they're going to live. So this presents us official statisticians with some problems. And we'll go on towards the end to find out what's happening in the Northern Ireland context, and Jonathan will explain about migration statistics in Northern Ireland. So, who are the EGRIS? There are 45 countries involved, all contributing case studies, bits and pieces, information, thoughts. and 24 regional and international organisations. So there are a lot of people involved in this. The UK Home Office was involved in early 2016, but I believe the lady went on maternity leave and we haven't really seen her since. So, if there's anyone here from the ONS or Home Office, then we'd be delighted to hear from them. So who are all these people? What is this alphabet soup? Because all the international organisations involved got overlapping mandates, both on refugees and other forms of displacement. So the one you've probably heard about is UNHCR, PAYME. They have a mandate for looking after refugees, stateless persons, asylum seekers, people returning after seeking asylum, and internally displaced persons, but not all of them. Only those who are trying to escape from human rights violations, conflict and war, but there are others. And UNHCR aren't responsible for all refugees. We also have UNRWA, who are responsible for the Palestine refugees, who was displaced during the period from 46 to 48. They're an entirely different set and impacted by different laws. At the ground level, we have Unhcr, who is responsible for bringing together the humanitarian actor. We have a number of special rapporteurs, one of whom we hope to be here today, but she couldn't come. Then also on the ground, we have the IOM, who does a lot of data collection. We have JIPS, who is the Joint IDP Profiling Service, who collects a lot of data, analyses the situation on the ground of internally displaced persons. And then we have IDMC, who puts out another lot of global estimates on displaced persons. And then we have ESO, who provide data on European Union asylum. So these are just some of them. So the idea was to get these people lined up and all agree on what was going to be collected, how we were going to collect it, and what the definitions and classifications would be. So just coming back to why it was a particular concern to the UN, you can see these are people of concern under UNHCR's mandate. So you can see there's the most enormous growth in the last 17 years. From about 20 million at the turn of the millennium to 70 million. This is the stock figure. So you can see a very huge growth. This is the stock of forcibly displaced people. So we've got about 70 million, 71 million of them displaced worldwide. 41 million are internally displaced, that means they haven't crossed the border. We've got 26 million refugees, 3.5 million asylum seekers. And that's probably an underestimate. But remember, this isn't all of them, because these are only conflict displaced. What about the flows? IDMC do the flows. So this is 2018, what do they estimate? We've got 28 million people in the world displaced in just 1 year. About 11 million of them displaced by conflict, and 17 million displaced by disasters. And you can see that they're not all in the developing world. This one here is the United States. Huge. Philippines is the biggest. So these are just flows. These are not refugees. These are just internally displaced people. So moving on quickly. So this is the evolution of the recommendations. So it's UNHCR and Statistics Norway that kicked this off in 2015. First expert conference in Turkey. Wasn't there. Mandate from the UN Statistical Commission, March 2016. And it took us 2 years to write it. And we were given an extension in 2018 to write similar recommendations for IDPs, which is much more challenging for refugees, and I'll try and explain why, and a compiler's manual. So that's the next stage, and that should go to the UN Statistical Commission in March 2020. And after that, we're hoping to start capacity development in many countries around the world to increase the flow of official statistics, because there aren't so many. So that's what we have. Those two publications, the recommendations, and a technical report on whether it was even feasible to collect data on IDPs. So let's come on to the nitty-gritty now. We'll start with these refugees and related populations. Refugees are, in a sense, more easy to define than IDPs because there is a legal definition. And this is defined by international law, to which UN members subscribe. This is the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol. And those are people who are seeking international protection outside their own country, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Notice, climate refugees are not there. So you have to have been impacted by some kind of conflict or human rights violation. Now we cover both those people who are legally refugees, and refugee status has been determined by a government, and related populations. And who are those related populations? Well, we have asylum seekers, which include both those who are currently seeking asylum and those who have not yet been able to do so. And you can imagine that if you were a Rohingya stuck in the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar, you wouldn't be able to claim asylum because you haven't got anywhere yet. And there may be many other bureaucratic obstacles in the way. So you have the intention of claiming asylum, but you haven't been able to do so yet. We've got the actual refugees, that's kind of easy, it's legally determined, and there are administrative records about them. But then we also have, as a population of interest, former refugees, people who were refugees and are now no longer refugees. We want to know how well they've got on. So if they've stayed in their host country, how well integrated are they compared with the host population? If they've gone home to their home country, have they been able to do so in dignity and in a kind of an orderly fashion? So we want to know how well those are doing. Then we also have the second generation refugees. So they may be refugees themselves, the children of refugees, but they may, by virtue of being born in their host country, also be citizens. So this is the scope of the classification of refugees, and I don't think this is what the UK produces. I think they probably cover the first three categories, but I think Jonathan will be able to say maybe a little bit more about that. And those returning home should be included in their home country statistics. And again, they often aren't. So let's have a few clarifications, because we see this in the press a lot. Refugees are not a subset of international migration, because they're not all migrants. So, for example, the Palestine refugees under the UNRWA mandate, they are refugees in perpetuity. They're on the male line, female line, on the male line, until the whole Palestinian question is settled. I've got a diagram in a few minutes which will say how big that growing population is. And then you may be a child of a refugee who was born in the host country, and you may not have been able to take the citizenship of that country. say you've not migrated, your parents migrated, but you may also be in turn a refugee yourself. And asylum seeking, as you know, is extremely complex. You can apply many times, be refused, and apply again. So it's not a one-off application. People can make many other subsequent. He says I've got to get on. Okay, UNHCR can determine whole groups of refugees, for example, Rohingyas, and there are other categories of international protection besides refugee, and I think we have some in the UK. Temporary protection, subsidiary protection, and so on. And not all in the classification are non-citizens. So some of the former refugees may have taken, for example, British citizenship. So, none of the things that we normally use, migrants, citizenship, are necessarily going to define your stock. So, that's the picture. These are the Palestinian refugees over in the left in dark blue, UNHCR refugees in the orange, international migrants in the light blue.
Is that roughly to scale?
Roughly to scale. This comes from UNHCR colleagues. I have to trust her. I didn't do it myself. So, this is the classification. A, persons in need of international protection. So those are the people that need protection from their own governments and have come overseas or crossed an international border to seek that protection. So it's asylum seekers, refugees, and all those other kinds of protection. Persons with a refugee background, so naturalised former refugees, children of refugees and their family members, and lots of these are likely to be citizens. And then you've got persons returned from abroad after seeking international protection, repatriated refugees and asylum seekers. And that includes people who failed. So came to the UK, applied for asylum, got sent home, still interested. And there is a more detailed framework sitting under that. And I won't bore you with it, but there's that's the full classification, and the one that's largely being used by Eurostat. 5 minutes left, right. So, we were a bit successful because we recommended some questions for censuses. And we'd recommended adding reason for migration. And one of the categories was to be forced displacement. Now that has recently come out in a guidance note from the UN expert group on migration statistics. And this is pretty much what they're recommending. For distinguishing migrants, country of birth, country of citizenship, country of birth of parents, getting a bit complicated here. And then I personally have some doubts about this, whether there are any household members who have ever resided abroad, or whether there are any household members who are currently residing abroad. Year or period of arrival in the country, whether they've acquired citizenship, and the reason for migration. And I won't go into where they will come. Now moving on, because I've only got 3 minutes left. IDPs, internally displaced persons. These are much more difficult to define. These are people who have been forced or obliged to flee their homes as a result of a whole long list of things. Armed conflict, generalised violence, violations of human rights, like refugees, or natural or human-made disasters. And if you think back to that early slide, this is the larger category. Who have remained living in the country's internationally recognised borders. So they have to stay within their own country. Now this is not determined by international law, but by a set of guiding principles who the UN is urging all member states to abide by. So this is it. forcibly moved by conflict, human rights abuses, natural or human-made disasters, slow onset disasters, and they have not to have crossed an international border. Now you can imagine in situations of turmoil, disaster, in countries with porous borders, something dreadful happened in Northern Ireland, I expect they will cross the border. This is kind of rather difficult to determine. And just to make life very difficult for statisticians, they may have moved within the same administrative area as they were previously living, so we might not even pick them up in internal migration statistics. And their responsibility of their own governments. An IDP status ends when they've reached a sustainable solution to their displacement, and I believe Phil is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, thank you, Mary. Can you click the next slide, please? Will you do your magic? So this is the end of part one of Mary's presentation. This displacement due to natural disasters, but not crossing an international border. Mary was saying she was in Montserrat when they evacuated the island to the island next door. And it was a natural disaster. But they crossed a border. So they're not internally displaced. But they're not something else.
They're not refugees either.
That's right, they're not refugees, because it was volcano related. Anyway, thanks to Martina, who I mentioned earlier, and she's got a couple of, 3 points, which she says are statistical challenges, especially from the legal statistical point of view, that come up in this definition of internally displaced people. She said, despite the broad agreement on the definition of internally displaced, applying it in practice poses a set of questions that don't always have a clear answer from a legal point of view. So there's huge variations in the way different states actually put it into practice. So 3 examples. IDPs are people who are forced to leave their homes or habitual place of residence. But what is that? From a legal perspective, she says, habitual residency is determined on both an objective basis, presence over a certain period of time, and a subjective one, the intention of remaining there. Though the definition found in the guiding principles doesn't provide a test for either of these 2 choices. Legal arguments continue. And it also raises the question of whether pastoralists and nomads fall within the IDP definition. The fact that pastoralists can become internally displaced is reflected in the guiding principles and in other important treaties. But how do you define their habitual residence? The second question that arises is those who the IDP definition includes people who flee as a result of or in order to avoid particular consequences. This element of the definition acknowledges that people can become internally displaced in anticipation of coercive factors, hazardous events, or life-threatening circumstances. And this includes emergency and mandatory evacuations or resettlement away from areas deemed to be unsafe or uninhabitable. Similar to the element of force, this anticipatory flight analysis is more difficult to assess in practice due to the fact the event hasn't yet taken place. And additionally, when the preemptive movements are linked to slow onset disaster situations such as drought or desertification or sea level rise, the element of compulsion may be even more difficult to demonstrate. And then the third problem is the definition of when a sustainable solution has actually been reached. The definition says there has to be a durable solution to their displacement. 10 years ago, she says, an international framework on durable solutions for IDPs was developed with the aim to provide clarity on the concept of a durable solution and provides general guidance on how durable solutions are achieved. The framework states a durable solution is achieved when IDPs no longer have any specific assistance and protection needs that are linked to their displacement and can enjoy their human rights without discrimination on account of their displacement. And its definition takes the position that the end of displacement is determined not by the location of the person, but rather by their level of access to human rights. So it's not the geographical movement alone that counts, especially, she says, because we know that most people who lived in a displacement situation over a protracted period, on average 17 years, prefer to integrate locally than return to their place of origin. So there is a framework suggesting 8 criteria to determine if they have been, this durable solution has been achieved, including safety, standard of living, access to livelihoods. Then it says restoration of housing, land and property, but which is a bit bizarre, I want to be perfectly frank, because they're displaced away from their housing, land and property. So it's real life, it's very difficult, she says, to actually measure all these conditions. So the risk is that even if we were in the position of measuring these aspects, we wouldn't ever be able to take any IDP off the list of being displaced. Right, so that was Martina's contribution. Thank you in absentia to Martina. So at this stage, are there any questions you'd like to put to Mary on the first part? Yes, Mary, would you like to face that way? Yes.
Well,
yes.
So I wonder if you could give us the broader picture on what these definitions are for and what sort of the goal is. I can imagine, for example, that defining, non-settled people, people who are migratory in their living, it makes it hard. But when we're talking about numbers in the 70 millions, it's a rounding error, right? So what is what matters for what at the UN level in terms of these definitions?
What matters is not leaving anyone behind, obviously. This is the objective, but also we need to know who they are, where they are, and how they're getting on before they can be assisted in trying to overcome their displacement-related vulnerabilities.
I don't want to imply that we should be leaving it, but is it a question for an individual person, their legal rights, that they're being defined as IDP or migrants, or is it a question for the system counting the numbers of people in each country?
It's for counting it and for governments to take action.
Okay.
So IDPs are responsibility of their own governments. If they don't know who they are or where they are, or what kind of difficulties they're facing, how can action be taken, either by their own governments or by the humanitarian community? And because it's highly political in Europe, how many of these asylum seekers are coming, how many refugees, and it seems to me that we don't really know what's happened to those who have got refugee status or those who take citizenship. What do we know about them?
How do we account for migrants or displaced people who are in no man's land, like on international waters? And secondly, you had a question on the census where you said, I'm not sure about these questions about the households.
Yes.
So if you have a group of migrants or displaced people enter into a country and then they split up, or someone goes for a better life in the US or gets a opportunity to get a green card somewhere, shouldn't they be accounted in that way in the census?
I mean, they could be. If the whole household has migrated, obviously you lose them and you pick them up in individual
Sometimes they
national
split up
census.
as well.
Yeah. So if the whole household emigrates, then you've undercounted the flow of households emigrating, which is why I have a few doubts.
But the first question, perhaps, people in no man's land in international waters, are they being measured at that stage?
Yes, they're being measured by UNHCR. So UNHCR will have them as prima facie case refugees. So this is where the group status of refugees is determined by organisations like UNHCR. But in the case of Rohingyas, they're also stateless people. So one of the next things coming down the line is a set of recommendations on statelessness, because we really don't know how many stateless people there are in the world. We have some estimates, but we don't know how many or how they should be counted. And they're often, obviously, ignored in official statistics.
Yes, was this? Just saying this.
So how often do you count these people? I mean, if it's only a census and the intention is to count people so that they can be helped, well, if you move just after a census, you've got like 9 or 10 years to wait, you know, before.
I mean, largely these numbers come from administrative records. So if UNHCR, for example, are administering some kind of benefits, which they do, or the IOM are administering some kind of benefits, then they get counted, they get picked up in administrative records. But we're also looking for the
So how
census.
often, what are they? How often are they?
So,
What are they?
an international body, UN
No,
affiliated
you
body.
said an administrative record. What are they? How often
So-
are they
so
collected?
They're collected continuously, so every time somebody is given some kind of benefit, then they'll be entered in a database and we'll have information about the household or the individual who's getting some sort of benefit from the humanitarian system. So most of the data that I've been showing you just now comes from administrative records, but we know that they're overlapping. UNHCR doesn't have a complete mandate for displacement. IDMC doesn't have a complete mandate. And where you have a situation of turmoil, there's a possibility of double counting or not being counted at all, because people on the move will go from one kind of sentinel site where they're counted to the next. So we're also looking at the census to kind of provide us with some verification about the stocks of displaced people.
There's a gentleman at the back.
Right, well, you've actually started to answer my question already there, but it was a rather technical one. So you've alluded to how difficult some of these questions are to gain estimates for. Do you have any idea what the kind of measurement area you're working with is and what plans, if any, are in place to try and improve these questions?
Well, the plans are to try to persuade countries to include these in their official statistics, because there are very few countries in the world that have displacement statistics. There are obvious examples of countries that do, where they have large displaced populations, but you won't see in most statistical programs any plans to collect these kinds of statistics, which is why we've got the recommendation on the census, because at least we'll be able to come up with some sort of broad brush estimate of the likely numbers of displaced people every 10 years. So we're getting administrative data from all these different humanitarian agencies, a few of whom I've listed, and colleagues of mine in UNHCR and IDMC do their best to come up with some estimates, but we've got no idea really how good they are.
Right, I'm sorry, we need to get Mary on to part 2 now. If I could ask you to park the rest of the questions till later.
I don't know if we can find it so interesting. Right, next. One of the things that's given us quite a lot of difficulty is determining people's country and place of usual residence. People on the move. What's their place of usual residence? And it's rather crucial here, because you'll remember back to our legal definitions. To be a refugee, you must cross an international border. To be an IDP, you must not cross an international border. And there's a bit of a lack of symmetry here. So you can be an IDP if you've been displaced by a disaster, but if you cross a border, you can't be a climate refugee. There's no such thing. There's legally no such thing. So it's rather important as to whether or not you cross an international border. And we've just mentioned Montserrat, but also Tuvalu, where you've got a very small island and you've got a very large disaster. Where do you go? There's nowhere to go, because if you cross your international border, you can't become a refugee. And then we've got the drought-affected Sahara. Large areas of the Sahara are impacted. People's livelihoods are impacted. People are beginning to migrate across the Sahara to escape from a slow onset disaster, which is the loss of pasture land and agricultural land. And again, these are not refugees. Therefore, the definition of international migration is very important. There's a very complicated diagram there, which which just shows that. So on the left-hand side, if you're forcibly displaced through violence, human rights violations and war, and you cross an international border, you could be a refugee. If you're forcibly displaced through natural man-made disasters and you cross an international border, you can't. So we've extended the definition a bit, or at least we're hoping to, because people live in countries with very porous borders. We're giving them kind of a 12-month limit to sort of wander about. If they fail to establish a new usual country of residence, and they come back home within 12 months, say, okay, you can be an IDP. So if an IDP crosses a border, but he or she fails to establish a new residence in another country in 12 months and returns to their country of habitual residence, they can still be in scope of our IDP statistics. And this is analogous really to other people who aren't easy to classify, these seafarers, international aid workers, undocumented migrants. These are, and I think we heard that in this morning's presentation, with people that have more than one country of residence, more than one home. So I think we need a bit more flexibility with these definitions. And displaced people need to be more clearly addressed in our definitions of residence. And I think people are beginning to realise that the recommendations which were in the 1998 recommendations are really not fit for purpose in the modern day. So we've got a couple of new terms here. We have this new statistical term, which Phil mentioned, place of habitual residence, and we've tried to define it. This is where one was usually resident at the time one was forced to move. So if I was living in Montserrat and the volcano erupted, that would be my place of habitual residence. Now the return to the place of habitual residence is a bit of an important concept, because despite what Martina said, we know that the Unhcr and IDPs remove people from IDP stocks once they return. They're not supposed to, but they do. Because there's no other way of removing people. Usual residence, very hard to define in situations of turmoil, because we don't have free choice. Frequent moves are characteristic. You move from place to place, from camp to camp, and may involve many border crossings in search of refuge. And our concepts assume certainty and some personal choice. So let me remind you what the census recommendations were. It's the place where a person lives at the time of the census and has been there for some time or intends to stay there for some time. And a threshold of 12 months is usually, we talked about this morning in the presentation earlier on. But there seems to be a move to let the individual choose, and I've just come up with a few here. And I hope ONS, I've got this right, the internet. ONS says a place where a person has lived continuously for 12 months or intends to live for at least 12 months. INSEE, a bit more relaxed about things, where one is accustomed to live. But you've got to have been there at least a month. New Zealand, a dwelling where a person considers themselves to usually reside. Canada, dwelling where the person lives most of the time. Philippines, where the person sleeps most of the time. Australia, very similar to ONS, including address at which a person lives or intends to live for 6 months or more. And homeless people, stateless people, those are hinges again. They're usually attributed to the place in which they are found. Now, I'm going to ask the question whether we should start to include the concept of habitual residence, cover both displacement And people who are moving around much more in the modern world, where do you think of as your home? Should we start to be thinking about that? And what's the possibility of confusing this with usual place of residence? And is this applicable in all countries?
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. First thing I should say is I'm Jonathan. I'm from the Census Office in Northern Ireland, dealing with population migration statistics and admin data and its use in the census. I was asked to provide almost an official statistic response to some of the issues and definitions and concepts that Mary has raised. Officially, I think I need to say I am not an expert. If we're talking refugees, the Home Office will be the primary source of information. ONS has its Migration Stats Quarterly Report, the experimental statistics it covers the UK as a whole. I'm not an expert. I've been furiously Googling the last couple of weeks. And the official statistic response for NISRA is that it's all a bit complicated. This is not simple. Mary has raised concepts like second generation of refugees. It sort of leads us into ideas like how these migrant populations have integrated locally. And for myself, this has been educational in terms of definitions like what is a refugee, what is a internally displaced. And so this, I've learned a lot, but I still don't know a lot. And so I'm speaking from a place of ignorance. I'm going to cover just a couple of things in terms of Northern Ireland, and I'll primarily be speaking about migration. So I'll cover a little bit about migration. I'll talk about where we're getting our information from. I'll cover very, very briefly some of the challenges that we would face with these concepts, and maybe a little about some of the census definitions that have also come up. So the first thing is Northern Ireland has a lot more migration than I expected. This is a reasonably new area for me. We've over 1 million border crossings a year. There's tons of back and forth. Over 13,000 international migrants in the mid-year to 2018 arrived in Northern Ireland from nearly 200 countries, which is surprising for myself. In terms of our inflows, we're primarily getting this data from health card registrations, and this would be for access to public health in terms of GPs, pharmacies, and dentists. And so this is really our first insight into where people are coming, because they have to prove their eligibility to receive treatment. And so it's the business support organisation, which works for the local health service, has a form where people have to fill in, explain their eligibility, explain their purpose of moving to Northern Ireland, so we can see how they arrived for work, they brought family. We'll see some information here. And we use this to measure inflows of international migrants of about 13,000 in the last year. As we know with administrative data, it's not perfect. It's used for health, it's not used for migration counting. And so we have to adjust it slightly based on what we know about underrepresentation of young adult males, for example. So we adjust our inflows based on the sex splits. I would compare them against the census records for the same time, and they're reasonably accurate. For outflows, we do the same. We see deregistrations and we see transfers to other areas in the UK. Again, about 3 out of 5 persons would deregister whenever they move, and so we don't always capture outflows, so we have to adjust it, and again we have to adjust for the female-male bias. We also have internal flows, so people moving about Northern Ireland. We would use health card data again, people who've moved, GP practices, and we also use the HESA data, which is the higher education, just to see students moving away from home and potentially backwards again. So that's Northern Ireland migration, primarily from health card data. And so this is the point at which we see migration, is at the point at which migrants access public services. So we'll see it in health card primarily, because it's the best population coverage. We'll also see it in education. So we'll see with a school census. So we'll see kids with English as a second language, country of birth and parents, not local, basically. And this is an important thing for us because as a small statistical agency, we're primarily getting our data from public providers, so the public service providers. That's where we're getting our information. And so we have to, really one of our challenges is that we must collaborate with the business support organization to fully understand our data and try and make as best use of it as possible. So Unhcr would actually fund a resource in that organization to try and help with that. The next thing is that we're rule takers, so we don't define who's eligible for healthcare. That's somebody else's legal responsibility. But we just take that information and hoover it up and try and provide estimates. Okay, the next thing would be that health card information, we're talking about a subset of a population in terms of refugees. And so it's quite a sensitive population. People can apply for refugee status based on a whole variety of different issues, such as sexuality. So the idea that we could take somebody's information and almost track it back and see why they came here and what they're doing, there's an ethical consideration there that we need to be very aware of. I think it's Data Ethics Day today. That will be something that we would be very aware of in our access and use of this data. We need to be able to provide a clear explanation of the public benefit, a clear explanation of how we keep the data safe, secure, and the ethical appropriateness of what we're doing with the information we have. So that's some of the background to migration around. Very little about refugees there, but we're sort of aware that this is a Northern Ireland issue. It's not just a UK issue. So we're aware there's over 400 Syrians have been placed in Northern Ireland through the Vulnerable Person Resettlement Scheme. About 5% of international migration is estimated to be refugees, asylum seekers. So it is an issue. It is a local issue. And clearly some of the definitions and concepts here raise issues for us in terms of how do we follow this? How do we tell a story of what's going on with this population? So it's very challenging, some of the concepts that Mary's raised here. Finally, in terms of census definitions, I thought it was really interesting to hear some of the recommendations there. For Northern Ireland, we previously had an intention to stay question on the census, and we're actually removing it because it turns out intention does not reflect reality. Potentially that was something Mary was raising in terms of people don't always have the choice. But what we were saying was people who didn't expect to stay for 12 months, 3 years later, most were still present as we tracked them through the healthcare data. So this is a very hard population to measure, and the official statistics position is really tricky. Thank you very much.
Before you sit down, Jonathan, does anyone like to pose any questions to Jonathan? Yes.
So you mentioned the sort of recent numbers of Syrian refugees that have arrived, and linking to what you were saying previously about the sort of being a refugee as an enduring concept. Once you've been a refugee, you are a refugee. What are you doing, or how do you anticipate you're going to be tracking the outcomes, particularly if in 10 years Syria is safe, some people might move back, but maybe their kids came here and this is their home as opposed to their place of residence, and how all these concepts intersect. So I'm assuming now maybe we're in a better place to look at that kind of thing compared to 20 or 30 years ago. Do you have any insights or forward plans, counting and tracking?
Briefly, no. I've no idea. Something that's been really encouraging for me recently is seeing what ONS has been doing in terms of it's almost moving beyond the official statistic or the annual publication and moving towards trying to in-depth tell a story of what's going on with a group of people. And I think that's definitely clearly part of what Unhcr is trying to do, to try to provide insight about the Northern Ireland population. And yes, we have over 1,400 Syrians. At what point did they become Northern Irish? Will they become Northern Irish? I don't know. What I reckon is we're moving more towards that. It's like a more developed, linked project where we're taking probably census data, maybe linking it with some of these indicators that might tell us more about this population. So I expect that's the direction we'll be going. Certainly in today's climate, migration is clearly a big issue. It's clearly not going away. And inward migration, that is international migration, is going up. And so I expect there will be more developments. So although I have nothing firm that I can point to, I expect there will be a lot more.
So not much precedent then in Northern Ireland.
Not much yet.
Yes.
You mentioned censuses and also so I'm not sure really who's the best place to answer, but when you've got several questions on the census that are very, very similar but just a slight nuance, where do you live now, where do you think you might live, and where have you been living previously, do you really think someone who doesn't understand English can actually understand the question? So therefore, can you really trust what's written on the census? I lived in Germany for a year and had to fill in a registration card. I could speak German when I went. I had a big enough dictionary. And the words they had on their form for even name and address were not even the normal words you thought for name and address. So, that was me trying to fill in that just to live there for a year. So, there's someone that's a refugee, they've had to shift because, they're probably going to get chopped in half by the government or something. They're probably not going to go to a country where they might speak a bit of the language. They're just going to land wherever they get dumped. So, do you think you can really trust the census data? If they see word address, they're possibly going to write anything that's related to address or.
As a member of the Census Office, I can officially say that we would trust it, and I'll try and explain that with what I know. So the census, the forms, I was going to say propaganda. The leaflets and the invites to participate, the advertising will be provided in multiple languages. So we will have the options for over 40 different languages. In Northern Ireland in particular, we're looking at online versions that will definitely be in Irish and also Scots as well. So we will have options. So what I would say is yes, we will have people who are refugees, who English is not the first language. We have ways of trying to accommodate that.
The gentleman back.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of discussion about the difficulties in getting data from the refugees themselves. So I wonder, I was thinking more about, I think you called it slow onset, which is the anticipation of something that might happen. Whether there's a way of doing some kind of, predictive modelling based on other data, as well depends on the past, to predict where people are likely to go and in what direction, rather than trying to get data from the refugees themselves. Is that something that's been looked up anyone?
Stand up next.
Yeah. We do have an idea that this is something that national statistical offices might do, to start to identify places that areas, enumeration areas that have been impacted by slow onset disasters, so that we had some kind of base to refer to if the person has had that as their previous place of habitual residence, and we know it's a slow onset disaster, then it starts to remove some of the doubt for whether they were economic migrants or whether they were in fact impacted by drought or something similar. But modelling, I don't know, we haven't got onto that yet, but that's a very good idea. Maybe that is something that could go into the compiler's manual that we're working on now.
Well, I'm just a bit concerned because what I learned is the refugees and what they said might just be used against them. So while they were coming from, say, crossing other European countries' border, they try not to get it to be fingerprinted, because or else they would be sent to the first country they wanted to. And is that a bad thing? So So I'm just wondering, just out of curiosity, do you share if a refugee decide to provide you with sort of fill-in form? Do you share with the UK authorities, which subsequently could maybe in their perception be used against them?
The question was that many refugees are worried about providing the correct information, and to what extent information perhaps collected would be shared with authorities who might then use it against them.
Data collected for statistical purposes, no, it can't be shared with other authorities. But I'm not quite sure how EASO, the European Asylum Office, shares their data. That I don't know. I can't answer that question. So data collected for statistical purposes, obviously under the Statistics Act, cannot be shared. But administrative data presumably can be.
I just reinforce what Mary said. We would collect this data for statistical purposes. If we're capturing is maybe the wrong word. If we're discovering migrants or refugees in health card data, they've generally proven their eligibility. I assume they wouldn't seek public services if they were scared of that. I don't know of any instances in Northern Ireland where there's been the onward transmission of statistical data for authority.
So I think the issue then is the fact that they may well be coming from countries where they don't trust their own authorities to handle their data sensitively at all. And as they set their foot across the border, how do they then immediately be brought to trust the fact that the UK and Northern Ireland authorities would look after it? Right, Mary, part 3. I guess
Yeah, but I know I was speaking with the Mexican Statistical Office a few months ago, and they said that this is an enormous problem for them because they've got people moving from South America up to the US border, coming through their territory, many of them, and they're not residents, they're just passing through. So how do they capture them, how do they deal with them, and how do they count them? And they're an enormous problem, so they need to know something about them. But
Right.
they don't want to be captured for that very reason.
Part 3.
Part 3, sorry.
And the final.
Oh, I've lost the... Part 3. Now, when Matthew asked me to do this, he set me a challenge which says they'll only be interested in things related to the UK. So this gave me a bit of a challenge. So, is this impermanence issue only problematic in developing countries? I had a good think about this in the bath. I thought no, because we've got a huge and growing proportion of our households living in the private rented sector. And it's growing hugely, just like those refugees, it's growing at an enormous rate. And most of those in the private rented sector are in short-term tenancies, which are usually for, I think, about 12 months duration, sometimes 6 months, but you can be got out very easily indeed. So we have now a growing number of households living in permanency in one of our tenures. And there's not too much official data about this, but I found a little bit, and Jonathan was able to provide me with a little more. So in the UK, we've got about 20% of our households in private rent, and in England, a quarter of these have lived in their house for less than a year. So if you think back to our concept of usual place of residence, we already have a problem because they've been there for less than a year and they're on a short-hold tenancy, so they don't know how long they're going to be there because it depends very much on the landlord. And I also found a Knight Frank article in The Guardian. It says that by 2021, 1 in 4 households in Britain will be renting privately. So we have a resident population. They may not be displaced, but they're living in increasing impermanence. So maybe it's something that we ought to think about. It's just something I stole from the English Housing Survey. Thank you very much, ONS. The middle one is private rented tenure, and the dark blue is people who have been living in their home for less than 1 year. And you can see the stark contrast between owner occupation, us old people, and those in private rented, those young people. and those lucky people in social rented. So, our definitions seem to have been forged in a world where there was more choice and certainty, and are official statistics able to properly reflect that volatility and impermanence of both our populations and displaced populations across the world? And it looks like rising generations are going to be increasingly unable to afford to buy their own house. So this impermanence may grow, and there's somebody does something about legislation for private rent. Then we come back to this concept of habitual residence. Where do you think is your home? Is this something we should be capturing? And our concept of usual residence, is this something that we should perhaps think about a little bit more carefully? Urging people to introduce the refugee and IDP concepts, which have been approved by the UN Statistical Commission and will be next March, we hope, and encourage all countries to try to implement this and include displacement statistics in their range of official statistics. So, I think we go to the discussion. I don't know whether you want to take over from here.
No, you could.
Okay. So how best do we reflect, I'm looking for ideas really to write down in compiler's manual, to reflect impermanence in mobile populations? Should definitions of usual place and country of residence be amended to cover this impermanence? Do we need to know where people consider their home? Should we here in the UK start to think about IDPs? What if that dam had burst in Whaley Bridge and those people had had to go and live somewhere else? They would be IDPs. People impacted by coastal erosion on the east coast of England. Again, also IDPs. And how feasible is it to introduce those international migration questions in our population census, or whatever it is you guys are going to replace it with? Thanks very much.
Right, well, thank you very much, Mary, and Jonathan as well. We have 20 minutes left. We can use as much or as little of it as you wish. But who's going to provide Mary with the answer to one of her questions or suggestions for the guidance manual?
Which is being written in the next month or so.
Right, which is being written in the next month.
But some of it's already written.
Or perhaps there's further comments. Yes.
On the point of should we measure our own IDPs, I'd have thought that might have been slightly easier to do than to measure worldwide IDPs. So maybe start with our own as like a practice test case, but also, you know, we shouldn't necessarily do to others what we don't do to ourselves.
Yeah.
Maybe out of fairness we should.
I don't know how many IDPs we have. I think there are more from the ONS. Lots of them.
I don't think some of them were even aware of IDPs. I remember, it's my friend is like, you know, he was buying a house. But when he was thinking, I'm just going to get somewhere like high up, so they won't get flooded in a way. But then, you know, it's pretty much sort of a, because of the problem, which people are making conscientious decisions to avoid in terms of this place. So
I think it comes back to a point somebody made earlier about what we're going to do with this information, and whether in fact IDPs in the UK are actually somehow at risk, you know, under threat in the same way as IDPs are, you know, who are moving because of drought and this sort of thing, because presumably there are social safety nets in the UK. Situations such as Whaley Bridge and that coast of Suffolk where all houses keep dropping into the sea.
But perhaps if we measured them, then local authorities could make a bid for funding to be able to deal with the costs.
Local authorities not measure things like rehousing though. So, for example, following Grenfell Tower local authority would have numbers of people that were rehoused, displaced inside or outside that relevant borough. So I assume there is something similar that is repeated in different parts of the UK, but probably only when it's something of scale. Again, for example, Whaley Bridge would fall under that type of situation.
Yes, and then you could imagine the question, the enumerator coming along from Kensington Authority saying to the person in this hotel room, do you consider this to be your habitual residence? How long do you intend to stay here? Or I had one question there, which was going right back to the beginning, with about slide 2, with all these different organisations, institutions collecting this information, sometimes on the same people at different stages in their journey. It is one of these, and you've got data from administrative sources, you've got data from people who are actually giving out food parcels, you've got data presumably of satellites looking at pictures of boats crossing the Mediterranean, and so on and so on and so on. It must be a very interesting job to rationalise these different sources.
But there's no complete picture. So everyone is publishing data according to their own limited mandate. So if one were to ask the question, what's the global estimate of all displaced persons, it would be difficult to answer that question. And they're each using their own definitions, concepts, classifications. So it's very hard to try to get a picture.
And when your work is finished, will we have a number?
We strive towards that number. And then for IDPs, countries with a big displaced population, for example Ukraine, for example Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraqi Kurdistan, they've actually got their own laws in place and they actually do measure the number of IDPs, but often their law does not quite accord with the concepts that I put up on the board today. So what we're trying to do is to get all countries' official statistics on displaced people to conform to those standards, which we hope will make them better.
Any other?
Just wondering, even if we have a number, how well that's communicated to people, because I know for a fact I'm Greek, and in the media, basically no one uses the word refugee. Basically, refugees and immigrants are the same thing, and I think people are not. I mean, I'm lucky enough to come to this conference and hear about this stuff in details, but I know there are many people who are not aware of this and how difficult the whole situation is for these people, and how scared must be to, keep all the facts. And yeah, I know in the beginning you said that you don't want this. The whole conversation might become a little bit obscure, but I think it is, and we cannot really avoid the conversation going towards that path, because in the end it's all about politics, unfortunately.
I agree with you very much, and because we're limited to our refugee definition, which was defined at the end of the Second World War, we're not really capturing the universe of people who've been displaced by climate-related and human-induced disasters. So all those people who have been displaced are trying to fit themselves into that refugee category and pretend perhaps that that they've been being tortured or that they've been victimised for their sexual orientation. So we've got the way in which the legal definition is posed is actually forcing people who are genuinely displaced to claim to have been displaced by other issues. So I don't think the kind of the international legal context is very helpful either for understanding what's going on in the world or producing statistics about, for example, our climate refugees are not being captured. I didn't even discuss how we're going to capture them, because that's not come up, because we don't have a category for them.
Yes.
Right, I was interested in the first slide you put up had various agencies. Several of them were UN agencies. How joined up is the UN in terms of trying to do the different definitions and different incentives that people have for?
Well, this is partly what we're trying to do, is to bring those agencies together, but certainly on the ground, I was trying to get some traction. If there is a disaster happens in a particular country, and we've got all these humanitarian agencies and the NGOs flooding in, who is coordinating this and who is, because at that point, we haven't got the countries collecting data for themselves, we've got a whole bunch of humanitarian agencies. So it's Unhcr which is supposed to be coordinating that activity, and they have some kind of emergency data office whose name I've forgotten, that does their best to try to put together the data. And I think that's one of the challenges, because when you're in a disaster situation, either the government isn't able to collect the data, or if they're implicated in the disaster in some way, it's going to be difficult to get neutral statistics from the government. So we often have a situation where we have the humanitarian agencies publishing one kind of number and a government publishing a different kind of number. Now, we're familiar with that, with all kinds of thematic statistics, but I think for displacement statistics, it is particularly political and particularly difficult. And I'm not quite sure what the solution is to that.
Any other comments? Right, well, we've got 10 minutes early. So thank you very much to Mary and to Jonathan for most